infiltrate the Illuminati, find out what the fuck they got going on, get the information, run back to y'all, tell y'all everything I know. That's my motherfucking job. But I don't know how many more times I'm gonna be able to sneak in there. Thanks to Shannon Sharp and 90 million views, I can't sneak very often. So while I was in there this last time, knowing that my last report might be my last report, I went in there and I got information for everybody. Look at my white friends. Us too? That's right, white.
They called her unstable, said she lost control, told the world she couldn't be trusted anymore. But what if none of that was actually true? What if one of the most outspoken voices in media was pushed out the moment she stopped playing by the rules? And now, what if she's not the only one? In a shocking wave of interviews, Katt Williams has started connecting dots that most people were never supposed to see. According to him, there's a pattern in Hollywood, one where careers don't just fade, they get erased, where people who speak too much suddenly get labeled, discredited, or completely cut off. And the names he's hinting at? They're not random, they're powerful, influential, untouchable. At least, that's what we're told. But here's the part that should make you pause. Because if even a fraction of this is real, then this isn't just about entertainment. It's about control. About who gets to speak and who gets silenced. So the real question is, how many more are next? Katt Williams has never been the type to stay quiet. But this time, the tone feels different. It's not just comedy, it's not just storytelling, it sounds like a warning. Over the years, he's hinted at things happening behind the scenes in Hollywood, but now he's speaking more directly, more boldly, and according to him, more urgently than ever before. What makes people stop and listen isn't just what he's saying, it's who he's talking about. Because when names like Wendy Williams start coming into the conversation, things get uncomfortable fast. For decades, Wendy Williams built a career off saying what others wouldn't. She asked the questions nobody wanted asked. She spoke on rumors that others were too afraid to even mention. And for a long time, that made her one of the most powerful voices in entertainment media. But then, almost suddenly, everything changed. Her show disappeared. Headlines shifted. And instead of being seen as bold or fearless, she was now being described as unstable, confused, and unable to continue. The same woman who once controlled the narrative was now the subject of it. Katt Williams believes that shift wasn't natural. In recent conversations, he suggested that when someone reaches a certain level of influence and refuses to fall in line, the system has ways of dealing with them. Not always directly, not always obviously, but effectively. According to him, it doesn't happen overnight. It starts slowly. Opportunities begin to disappear. Public perception starts to change, and then eventually, the person themselves becomes the story. That idea alone is enough to make people skeptical, but it becomes harder to ignore when you start noticing patterns. Katt has talked about his own experiences, how he turned down major opportunities that came with conditions he wasn't willing to accept. He's described situations where success wasn't just about talent, but about compliance. Where saying no didn't just mean missing out, it meant being pushed out. And he's not the only one who's made that choice. Dave Chappelle is another name that keeps coming up. At the height of his career, when most comedians would do anything to secure their position, he walked away. Not from failure, but from success. A deal worth tens of millions of dollars, gone, just like that. At the time, people didn't understand it. Some thought it was a breakdown. Others believed he had lost perspective. The narrative quickly shifted from genius to confusion. But years later, Chappelle himself explained that it wasn't about the money. It was about the environment he was in and what was being expected of him. Katt Williams points to moments like that as proof that something deeper is happening. Not necessarily a conspiracy in the way people imagine, but a system, a structure where power is protected, and those who challenge it are quietly removed from the spotlight. And then there's the issue of control. Katt has claimed that in Hollywood, contracts can become more than just business agreements. They can become leverage. Once someone signs onto a major project, especially at the highest level, The expectations go beyond performance. There are obligations, pressures, and sometimes requests that have nothing to do with the work itself. According to him, that's where the real test begins. Because once you're in, walking away isn't easy. There's money involved, reputation involved, and in some cases, everything you've worked for is on the line. So when someone does walk away or refuses to comply, it doesn't just affect them. It sends a message. And that message doesn't always stay behind closed doors. Sometimes it plays out publicly. Careers stall, stories change, and the person who once had full control over their image suddenly finds themselves being redefined by others. That's why the situation with Wendy Williams stands out so much. Because from the outside, it looks like a sudden decline, a health issue, a personal struggle. But from Katt Williams' perspective, it fits into a larger pattern, one where speaking too openly comes with consequences. Now, to be clear, not everything he says can be verified, and not every situation is the same. But what keeps people watching is the consistency in the theme. The idea that in an industry built on image, controlling the narrative is everything. And once that narrative turns against you, it's almost impossible to take it back. Katt has also spoken about how quickly public opinion can be shaped. One headline, one rumor, one carefully placed story. And suddenly, the audience sees you differently. It doesn't matter what you've done before. It doesn't matter how long you've been respected. The shift can happen overnight. And in today's world, where information spreads faster than ever, that shift can be permanent. What makes this even more complicated is that the audience often doesn't realize they're being influenced. People trust what they see, what they hear, what's repeated across platforms. And when multiple sources start saying the same thing, it feels like truth, even if it started somewhere else. That's the power Katt Williams is talking about. Not just control over careers, but control over perception. And once perception changes, reality tends to follow. The question then becomes, how many times has this already happened without people noticing? How many careers have quietly faded under similar circumstances? How many voices have disappeared without explanation? Because if even part of what Katt is suggesting is accurate, then this isn't just about one person or one situation. It's about a pattern that's been repeating for years. A pattern where stepping outside the expected role comes with a price, and not everyone is willing or able to pay it. What's even more interesting is how these stories often resurface years later, when the pressure has faded and people feel more comfortable speaking openly. Details start to come out, perspectives shift, and things that once sounded unbelievable suddenly don't seem so far-fetched anymore. But by then, the moment has passed. The damage has already been done, and the focus has moved on to someone else, which brings us back to the present. Because if Katt Williams is right, then what we're seeing now isn't the beginning. It's part of an ongoing cycle, one that continues behind the scenes, shaping careers, controlling narratives, and deciding who stays in the spotlight and who doesn't. And if that's the case, then the real story might not be about what's already happened. It might be about what's coming next. As the conversation gets deeper, Katt Williams doesn't just talk about what happened. He starts pointing toward how it happens. And according to him, the system isn't loud or obvious. It doesn't need to be. It works quietly, through influence, pressure, and timing. Because in Hollywood, power isn't always about who's on camera, it's about who controls what the audience sees. Katt describes it like a game most people don't even realize they're playing. You can be talented, successful, and respected, but the moment you stop aligning with certain expectations, things begin to shift. Calls don't come in the same way. Deals slow down. And eventually, the opportunities that once seemed guaranteed start disappearing. Not because the talent is gone, but because something else has changed. And that's where the idea of being controlled comes into play. Now, that doesn't always mean something extreme or dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's about agreeing to things you're not fully comfortable with. Sometimes it's about staying silent when you'd rather speak. And over time, those small compromises can turn into something much bigger. Katt Williams has made it clear that for him, those compromises weren't an option. He's openly talked about turning down major offers, opportunities that could have elevated his career even further, but came with expectations he wasn't willing to meet. And according to him, that decision came with consequences. Because when someone proves they can't be influenced, they also become unpredictable. And in an industry that thrives on control, unpredictability is a problem. That's when the narrative begins to shift. Suddenly, the focus isn't on the work anymore, it's on the person. Stories start circulating, past incidents get revisited, and the image that once made someone successful starts being questioned. Katt has suggested that this isn't accidental, that it's part of how the system protects itself, not by directly removing people, but by changing how they're perceived. Because once the audience stops believing in you, the rest becomes easy. And this is where things start to connect back to other names. Dave Chappelle's situation is often used as an example, not because it's identical, but because of how quickly the narrative around him changed when he walked away. At one moment, he was at the top of comedy. The next, there were questions about his mental state, his decisions, and his future. And while Chappelle eventually returned and rebuilt his position, Katt Williams argues that not everyone gets that chance. Some people disappear before they can explain themselves. Others try to speak out, but by then, their credibility has already been weakened. And that's the key point: credibility. Because in today's world, once someone is labeled a certain way, it's incredibly difficult to reverse that perception. Whether it's being called unstable, difficult, or unreliable, those labels tend to stick. And once they do, everything that person says gets filtered through that lens. So even if they're telling the truth, it doesn't land the same way. That's why Katt keeps coming back to the idea of timing. He believes that when someone becomes a problem, the system doesn't react immediately. It waits. It watches. And then, when the moment is right, when the conditions are perfect, the narrative shifts. And by the time people notice, it's already too late. This perspective also ties into something else he's mentioned: how money plays a role in all of this. Because at the highest levels of entertainment, the stakes are massive. We're not talking about small deals or minor projects. We're talking about contracts worth tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. And when that kind of money is involved, control becomes even more important. Katt has suggested that these contracts can sometimes include conditions that go far beyond the work itself. Expectations that aren't always visible to the public. Agreements that shape not just what someone does on screen, but how they behave off-screen as well. And once those agreements are in place, walking away isn't just difficult, it can be damaging. Because leaving a deal like that doesn't just affect the individual, it affects everyone connected to that project. Studios, producers, investors, all of them have something to lose. So when someone steps out of line, the response isn't always direct confrontation. Sometimes it's about minimizing the impact. And one of the easiest ways to do that is by changing how the person is seen. Katt Williams has hinted that this is where things can get complicated, especially when personal issues are involved. Because real-life struggles, whether it's stress, health, or legal situations, can be amplified, reframed, or even used as part of the narrative. And from the outside, it becomes almost impossible to tell where the truth ends and the story begins. That's why cases like Wendy Williams continue to raise questions. Because while there are confirmed aspects of her situation, there are also gaps. Moments that don't fully make sense. Transitions that feel sudden. And when you place that alongside Katt Williams' perspective, it creates a different way of looking at things. Not necessarily a confirmed explanation, but an alternative angle. One where the timing, the narrative, and the outcome all seem connected. Katt has also brought up the idea that fear plays a role in keeping this system in place. Not fear in an obvious sense, but a quiet understanding among those in the industry. A recognition of what can happen if certain lines are crossed. Because when you see others go through it, when you watch careers shift, reputations change, and opportunities disappear, it sends a message without needing to be spoken. And for many, that's enough to stay in line. But every now and then, someone chooses not to. Someone decides that the cost of staying silent is higher than the risk of speaking out. And those are the moments that stand out. Those are the moments that people like Katt Williams focus on, because to him, they reveal something about how the system works, not in theory, but in practice. Still, it's important to recognize that not everything can be taken at face value. These are perspectives, interpretations, and experiences, not all of them backed by concrete evidence. But at the same time, they're not coming from nowhere. They're coming from people who have been inside the system, people who have seen how things operate at the highest levels. And that's what keeps the conversation going. Because even if only part of it is true, it raises questions that are hard to ignore. Questions about power, about influence, about who really decides what the public sees and what it doesn't. And as more people start paying attention, those questions are only getting louder. Which leads to the next layer of this story. Because according to Katt Williams, this isn't just about individual careers anymore. It's about something bigger. Something that connects multiple industries, multiple people, and multiple stories into one pattern. And if that's the case, then what we've talked about so far might only be the surface. As the story continues to unfold, Katt Williams takes things even further, not just talking about Hollywood as an industry, but as a network. According to him, what people see on the surface is only a small part of what's really happening behind the scenes. The real power, he suggests, exists in connections that go far beyond movies, music, or television. And this is where the conversation starts to get even more controversial. Because Katt doesn't just talk about influence, he talks about access, about who gets invited into certain spaces, who gets introduced to certain people, and how those connections can shape an entire career overnight. In his view, success at the highest level isn't just about talent or hard work. It's about proximity to power. And once someone reaches that level, they're exposed to a completely different side of the industry, one that most people never see. That idea becomes even more intense when names like Jeffrey Epstein enter the conversation. Now, Epstein's case is real, documented, and deeply disturbing. His connections to powerful individuals across different industries have been widely reported. But Katt Williams uses that example to suggest something broader, not just a single case, but a pattern of how influence and secrecy can operate at the highest levels. According to him, people like Epstein didn't operate in isolation. They were part of a larger system where information, leverage, and control all played a role. And while not everyone involved in those circles was guilty of wrongdoing, the existence of those networks raises serious questions about how power is maintained. Katt also points toward the idea that once someone is connected to these circles, even indirectly, it can change how they're perceived, or how they're protected. And that's where things start to overlap with other public figures. He's mentioned individuals like Chris Tucker, not necessarily accusing them of wrongdoing, but highlighting how even being in the same environment, being on the same flight, attending the same events, can create speculation that follows someone for years. And that's an important distinction, because being associated with something doesn't automatically mean being involved in it. But in the world of public perception, those lines can blur very quickly. Katt Williams seems to understand that better than most. He's repeatedly emphasized how easy it is for a narrative to be built around incomplete information. One photo, one connection, one moment taken out of context, and suddenly, a completely different story begins to form. And once that story takes hold, it can be almost impossible to separate fact from assumption. That's why he keeps bringing the focus back to control, not just control over actions, but control over information. Because in his view, the real power isn't just in what happens behind closed doors, it's in what the public is allowed to know about it. And more importantly, what they're not allowed to question. Katt has also touched on something that adds another layer to all of this: the role of silence. Not enforced silence in an obvious way, but a kind of unspoken agreement. A culture where people understand the risks of saying too much, where certain topics are avoided, not because they don't exist, but because addressing them could come with consequences. And over time, that silence becomes part of the system itself. Because if no one is speaking openly, then nothing ever has to be fully explained. That's why moments where people do speak out, whether it's in interviews, podcasts, or unexpected conversations, tend to gain so much attention. Not just because of what's being said, but because of what it might represent. A break from the pattern, a glimpse into something usually kept hidden. But even then, Katt Williams suggests that those moments don't always lead to change. Sometimes they're dismissed. Sometimes they're overshadowed by other stories. And sometimes, the person speaking out becomes the focus instead of the message. Which brings everything back to perception once again. Because at the end of the day, the audience plays a role in all of this too. What people choose to believe, what they choose to question, and what they choose to ignore. Katt's perspective challenges viewers to look beyond the surface, to consider the possibility that not everything is as straightforward as it seems. But at the same time, it also raises an important point about responsibility. Because while it's easy to get caught up in the idea of hidden systems and unseen forces, it's just as important to approach these claims with a critical mindset. Not everything is a conspiracy. Not every coincidence is connected. And not every story has a hidden agenda behind it. But that doesn't mean everything should be accepted at face value either. The truth, as it often does, likely exists somewhere in between. A mix of real experiences, personal interpretations, and unanswered questions. And that's what makes this conversation so complex. Because it's not just about proving or disproving one claim. It's about understanding how influence works, how narratives are shaped, and how easily perception can be guided without people even realizing it. Katt Williams isn't presenting a traditional argument. He's sharing a perspective, one that comes from years of being inside the industry, observing how things operate, and making choices that set him apart from others. Whether people agree with him or not, that perspective has started a conversation. One that goes beyond entertainment, one that touches on power, control, and the systems that exist in the background of some of the biggest industries in the world. And as more people begin to pay attention, that conversation is only getting bigger. Because at its core, this isn't just about celebrities. It's about a pattern where certain voices rise, others disappear, and the reasons behind it aren't always clear. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the lack of clarity is what allows the system, whatever it may be, to keep functioning without being fully understood. Or maybe it's simply the result of an industry that's far more complicated than it appears from the outside. Either way, one thing is certain. The more these stories are discussed, the harder it becomes to ignore them completely. And whether you see it as exposure, speculation, or something in between, the conversation isn't going away anytime soon. If you made it this far, you already know. This isn't just another story you scroll past and forget. This is one of those conversations that stays in your mind, makes you question things, makes you look at the industry a little differently. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think this is all just coincidence? Or do you believe there's something bigger happening behind the scenes? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the real discussion starts there. And if you found this breakdown interesting, make sure you hit that like button. It helps more people see this kind of content and keeps the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't just end here. New details, new perspectives, and new voices are coming out all the time. And you don't want to miss what happens next. Stay aware, stay curious, and most importantly, keep asking questions. Because sometimes, the truth isn't what you're told, it's what you're willing to look deeper into.